Hi everybody, it's me again, Billy, and this is Antioch, Chapter 2, Homestead. A storm gathered in the south as John rode up the farmhouse path. On his pinto filly he sat head and shoulders over the rusty plants on either side. His hair waved long and iron gray below his baldness. He was 64 years old, paunchy, and his white tabard's golden circle sparkled in the sun. Far before the house the horse whined and slowed on its own. John patted her neck. "Shh, there's a good girl. Don't run. Easy." He noticed distinct movement in the cropse tops about 50 yards out. Clucking at his nervous filly and scratching her mane, he reached down and lifted his Callaghan from the saddle. "All right, I'll walk." He landed with a solid thump on the dry dirt road. The horse pulled against the reins, already backing up. John let go and his eyebrows went up in surprise. She wrenched over backwards and bolted away in a cloud of dust. "Oh, well, that's fine. At least you let me get down first this time." The field towered over him in two walls of stalks to make a brown, windless corridor. Withering leaves hung from those lengths like dead tongues. John buckled his scabbard's belt around his waist and called out, "Horace!" He heard something coming. Drawing the long-handled sword, he called out again, "Horace!" Then he raised it with a form almost identical to Michael's and opened the way, ready to strike. Horace would have answered him by then. Any person should have answered him by then. The plants opened, and John was shocked. A small girl, no more than 5 years old, hobbled from the field. Blood clotted in her clothes and hair as though she'd taken a swim in it days before. She trailed smoke like a breathless fire. One leg took her weight and wagging steps, with its thigh bones broken ends in the meat like climbing spikes. John just stood there as she came, watched her take hold of his leg and bite into the chain. Between his armor and her unnatural strength, her tiny teeth cracked. He came to his senses, cursed, "Fwah!" and sheathed his weapon. He unfastened a gauntlet from his sleeve and put his naked hand on the little ghoul's forehead. His ring finger was missing. She ignored his touch and continued gnawing, the splinters of her teeth snapping in the pulp. The gruesome grinding and popping sounds made it difficult for John to concentrate. He was trying to open the way in her, but he couldn't find it. She was empty. "What is this? I don't understand." His eyes began to water, and then to burn. He reeled back, choking and coughing, having taken a full breath of the smoke that had collected around him, without the wind to blow it away. Golden light burst from his eyes, nose, and mouth, and his throat glowed red from within. He stumbled out of the lingering haze with the monstrous child still clinging to his leg. In the clean air, the light faded from his face. The decision was hard but quick. John drew his Callaghan again. With his bare hand on the grip, and his armored hand on the blade, he placed an edge against the back of her small neck. She ignored what was coming, just as she had ignored his healing touch. He pulled until the edge bit metal. She collapsed, decapitated. John turned away and flung his Callaghan into the ground. He stood muttering and shaking his head as he refastened the gauntlet. He hadn't come home to the farm in more than 18 years. He didn't know who the little girl had been, who she'd been to Horace, who she might have been to him. Without looking at the body, he snatched up his filthy cleaver, shoved it into the scabbard, and started jogging toward the farmhouse. The old building's thatched roof showed over the plants before the corridor opened into the front yard. The door was ajar. A tilted wooden cart piled with hay blocked John's view of the adjacent barn. The wind in the yard, cool from the coming storm, had a savage stench. The boots of a man on his back stuck out from behind the cart. John hurried around and found a slender corpse. A garden spade was driven into the earth just above the lower jaw. The rest of the head was gone. Bulbous black flies boiled in the smoke between the blade and the throat. A wide dark stain surrounded the wound on the ground, and an intermittent pattern of ink led from there to the barn. John didn't recognize the body. Trying to make sense of the scene, he thought, Horace wouldn't have been so slight. No, he'd have been the one with the shovel. He shouted, "Horace!" and waited, listening to the field and the flies. If Horace did this, he'd have taken in the sickness. John could only guess at how long a man could withstand the smoke without being able to open the way. He followed the black trail through the barn's gate, where the wind died and dust hovered in slanted sunlight. There, a 30-yard toss from the body, on its cheeks and teeth beneath a bench, the severed head seethed with insects. Dull gray eyes stared from the scuttle. John's mouth was dry when he tapped it with his fingers to chase the bugs away. It wasn't Horace. He looked around. Dark little footprints nearby became more defined as they walked backwards into a broad pool of dried blood, where a dead pig was tied by a rope around its neck to the slaughter post. The animal had been bled, but not by any method John knew. Its skin was torn open in sheets. Flies lifted from the carcass when John approached. He found a funnel, a long knife, and a pail on the shelf above. They were clean and sharp, ready for a bloodletting. He put them down and headed for the farmhouse. The front door screeched under the weight of its planks. It was dim, cool, and quiet inside. John shouted, "Horace!" over and over as he searched the old house, the house that had once belonged to him. He was afraid of what he'd find behind each door that he opened. There was a man's room with the mounted skull of a giant elk. Antlers spanned 12 feet from wall to wall. There was a boy's room with a bit of fishing tackle, and then, saddest of all, a girl's room with a rag doll and some little dresses. He went into the kitchen. The back door's light cut the silent, windowless space in two. It was a disaster. Clay jugs and jars had been smashed everywhere. The table had been overturned against the fireplace. Clumsy tracks sketched through the flour, soot, and blood that caked the floor. He saw little footprints again, and also a much larger set made by a very large man. Those led outside, past a raised stone well, and headed into the woods behind the house. John followed them, still calling his son's name. That is the end of Chapter 2. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99 or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for Chapter 3, Breog and Bowron.